Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here with us for this 30-minute webinar that is going to really tackle a topic I know a lot of us are thinking about right now, which is where are we as a country and as workplaces when it comes to our DEI initiatives. And I have an amazing guest with me today. We're going to look at this topic and think about some thoughtful questions. For those of you who have not joined us yet for one of these webinars, this is part of our Navigating the Uncharted webinar series put on by the National Conflict Resolution Center. We have created these starting about a year and a half ago, really to help workplace leaders and employees address the ever-changing workplace dynamics that are happening around the country and globally today in workplaces. And so we've tackled topics such as how to get your workplace election ready, how do you lead with transparency as a workplace leader, navigating intergenerational workforces, and many, many other topics. And so if you're tuning in today and this is your first time, please know that we have all of these workshops, these webinars available on our website, ncrconline.com. You're welcome to tap into them. We offer them as just a free resource for workplace leaders as we're navigating these issues together. And so today's webinar is going to be about 30 minutes in length, and we are going to have an opportunity for some Q&A. And so if you have a thoughtful question that you want to pose, please feel free to post it in the Q&A section, not the chat section, but the Q&A section of the webinar. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can, because we want to honor your time and because this is just a 30-minute webinar. If we don't get to all of the questions, please know that we'll follow up. We always do kind of a written follow-up as well as send out the link to this webinar after the fact. And so we'll try to answer those questions after the fact. So with that, I mentioned, our whole purpose in this Navigating the Uncharted webinar series is to address and discuss topics that are changing, shifting, and I can't think of a more shifting topic and one that's maybe more important to workplaces today than that of DEI and DEI initiatives for our workplaces. And so I am so delighted that today I am joined by S. Mitra Kalita, and I just want to read you a little bit of her bio. Mitra is an award-winning journalist who's worked for the likes of CNN and Los Angeles Times. She's also been a regular columnist in publications like Fortune, Time Magazine, and Charter. She is the author of 2 books related to migration and globalization, and she speaks 7 languages, although she jokes that only 4 of them she speaks half decently, but I'd still say that's a lot more languages than I speak, so I'm very impressed. But most relevant to our conversation here today, she's the co-founder publisher of Epicenter NYC, which is a multi-platform network based in New York City. And she is CEO and co-founder of URL Media, which is a network of Black and Brown community news outlets that share content and revenue. And so with that, Mitra, we're so glad to have you. I would love to kick it off just asking you to tell us a little bit more about URL Media. This is such an interesting concept and organization.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I'm really, really honored. And I love the work that you all do. So URL Media was actually born out of Epicenter NYC. So I launched a newsletter in the spring of 2020. I was still at CNN. I was a news executive there. And was just frustrated because in the middle of the pandemic, my neighborhood in Jackson Heights, Queens, was very hard hit in the pandemic. And so just as neighbors, my husband and I found ourselves fielding queries over where to get masks, how to get a COVID test, funeral arrangements, unfortunately, for families, translation services. I mean, you all kind of remember that moment. And so we launched a newsletter just to share these tips back and forth in a way that it felt like a CNN was actually limited in the ability to be that force on the ground. And eventually Epicenter became a newsletter and then became a multi-platform community media company. I left CNN What else happened in the spring of 2020? Of course, were the racial justice protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd. And in the course of launching Epicenter, but also observing this coverage and this moment, and kind of a question of like, is it a moment? Is it a movement? Like, does this time feel different than previous, police incidents? Does it feel different than other racial justice movements and protests? My co-founder ended up being a woman who I had turned to as I was launching Epicenter pretty regularly for advice, a woman named Sarah Lomax, who's the president and CEO of WURD, a Black radio station in Philadelphia. And in the course of kind of comparing notes and just asking aloud, like, is this time different? Should we be doing something? Should our media be changing to reflect what feels like a very different conversation than the one Sarah, who'd been in Black media, me in mainstream media, but really pushing diversity conversations within the mainstream? It felt like those two forces were coming together. And so URL Media was born out of a belief that we actually need to turn to communities on the ground, communities of color. We need to support community media and Black and ethnic media that have been doing this work, but we didn't want to lose the ability to redefine the mainstream, to penetrate the mainstream. So as you mentioned, we share advertising revenue. We have a executive recruitment and placement arm that does a lot of DEI work and ensures diverse talent management. And we also share content. And so it's, I guess, a way, and this will probably come up in our conversation, but how do you enable people to be who they are, but be a part of a collective and really unleash the power of the collective and scale without sacrificing who we are?
Hmm. So something that was really born out of the uniqueness of the year that 2020 was. And it sounds like you were really responding to needs that you were seeing and have created something very special. So I kind of want to go back to 2020 a little bit. We all saw this huge swell of support for DEI initiatives in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the really racial injustice conversations that were happening around the country. And I know part of what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of the waning of that support and some of the shifts that we've seen more recently. But I want to actually start with the positive first. And I want to ask you, what do you think has been the greatest accomplishment of DEI initiatives over the last 4 years? Like what's gone right in the last 4 years?
It's such a good reflect. Like, I think it's important to reflect on some of the positive outcomes here. I mean, one is the institutional support for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Hardly 2020 was the only catalyst for someone having a chief diversity officer. Many, many companies, of course, had that role before, but that title just exploded in terms of companies adding that to the C-suite. And I think that's an important part of it, that you saw a shift from diversity being under human resources as a direct initiative of the CEO, right? Really in the C-suite, as opposed to managed under another department. So I think actually that's a positive, just like staking the claim in this being a priority for companies. We can talk about what's happened there, but I think that is an assertion of values, business values of an employer. The second piece is actually the not institutional, but it's our own behaviors. And so it used to be that, what is the opposite of racism? People would just say, I'm not a racist, right? I don't see color is like a phrase that people would use. And actually, 2020 really shined a spotlight on what are you doing? What are you actively doing to be anti-racist? And that framework, of course, became much more mainstream, if you will. There are several books that talk about what it means to be anti-racist. This is something that we continue 4 years later to have control over in our own lives. And that might mean, who are you friends with, right? Who defines your community? Are you espousing the principles of DEI that you're talking about at work in your personal life? Are you raising your children to have a consciousness of the real history of the United States? Who writes the books that you're reading to your kids every night, right? And so small decisions actually play an outsized influence on so many aspects of um, our commitment to inclusion. And I think that belief that our behaviors can actually be a part of this revolution is actually a very empowering outcome of 2020.
So yeah, I really agree with you. I think seeing that just even more conversations were happening around this, and the question was being asked, what can we do? In our work at NCRC, I think we see a lot of the organizations that were asking those questions and helping kind of guide them through, like, how do you have those sometimes difficult conversations, but
Right.
they're necessary?
Yeah.
How do you have those conversations, and how do we do this effectively? So I agree with you. It's been really great to see that, because that's the starting point, right? Is the individual actions that can be taken, and then let's just have the conversations. And that actually kind of leads me to my next question for you. And this one may be a little bit trickier, but so, we saw the swell of support. I think we saw a huge amount of effort and budget put into DEI initiatives in workplaces. And then just over the course of the last 4 years, we have seen that get chipped away at. We've seen that those, departments have been cut back, employees have been cut back, maybe training initiatives. And for folks who are in the space of DEI, this can feel very discouraging. Like, are we taking a step back? Are we still, what's happening here? And
Yeah.
so I think we can definitely say, politics play a role, but I want to think outside of just politics, because that kind of makes it like this other problem. I want to kind of think about the fact, and we think about this a lot in our organization, somewhere along the line, we just didn't bring enough people along in this conversation. And so I wonder what your thoughts are about that. And, was there anything that could have been done differently, or that we should think about differently now? How do we bring more people into this conversation so that everyone is really more supportive of this instead of it being a divisive issue?
It's a great framework for a question like that. I mean, I think some of it, like, I think it's just worth looking at the history of the last 4 years, right? So the racial justice protests came in the middle of the pandemic. And I don't think that's coincidental, right? People of color disproportionately both felt the brunt of COVID, but were also the solution to getting us through that moment. And if you think about, healthcare workers and essential workers and, the people that we celebrated, as well as the people who could not embrace social distancing or quarantine, which became pretty mainstream terms, but actually in neighborhoods like mine in Queens, impossible for communities of color to engage in social distancing when you might live many to a one-bedroom apartment, right? So I think it's also just worth unpacking, like, there was an exposure of systemic racism in 2020. You have a period of COVID where I think there's a lot of activity and engagement and activism, but it's kind of armchair because we're at home. Like, a lot of people are able to spew how they're feeling on Facebook and Twitter and platforms that have since come in and out of fashion. Like, their algorithms have changed, but so you saw a period of engagement, and then we all had to really deal with each other in real life, right? As we're coming, and so that's the period I think we're in now. Some of it is a backlash, for sure. And as you mentioned, some of it is political. But I also think that the conversation was defined by the polls versus the reality of how we all actually live our lives and think about issues. So what do I mean by that? There's a tendency, and this is, research has shown this, when there are conversations on social media, it's the extreme points of view that people tend to post about. If they're feeling mixed, like, I support affirmative action, but I also, would like there to be, less regulation on my small business as we're making our way through, the red tape of like setting up in a city, right? It's possible to be liberal on some social issues and conservative on some fiscal issues. I mean, this is like classic, like how our democracy operates, right? And that nuance and that complicated nature of opining, if you will, I think has been somewhat lost. And then again, we all have to deal with each other. And we don't exist in these polls of what our Facebook posts might say. And so, what happens if you see people only engaging in the polls, people who might have either more nuanced points of view or intersectional points of view, right? So, guess what? Like all African Americans are not a monolith. You might have generational divides. You might have Afro Latinos that have multiple identities. There might be gender fluidity. There might be very conservative church going beliefs. So you have all of this collision, even within our own communities, and there isn't necessarily a space for that. And where has that played out? The two spaces that I've seen, and I think this is bearing out in our news coverage, are in workplaces, right? We all deal with each other, and schools, college campuses, but are also our children's schools in the lunchroom. And so I think there is a backlash in the form of, book banning, not having diversity, offices that are specifically set up for this. But it comes from the discomfort with, I think, a certain vision of it versus what's the I in DEI? It's the inclusion of there might be many, many points of view and perspectives. And I'm not going to say all of them are valid because there's definitely some crazy in there, but actually many of them are valid, right?
Yeah, we were, I know when we were talking a little earlier before the webinar started, we were talking about the Washington Post article that just came out, I think this morning, right?
Mhm.
That basically was showing data that says that there's actually more people in the country in agreement that DEI initiatives are a good thing than there are divided. And I think that's something that we all have to keep in mind. And we certainly see that in our work. We do a lot of inclusive communication training. And when we go into organizations, and I'm talking, we work everywhere, red states, blue states, white collar, blue collar. We're working with a lot of different individuals who are looking at inclusivity in all aspects of what that word means, right? And it's not just racial, it's inclusivity of so many, of gender, of educational background. I mean, gosh, even of political viewpoints at certain times. And so
Right.
it's such an important conversation to be having. And what I think we lost sight of, which you talked about, is we lost that ability to
Yeah.
have some of these disagreement conversations where we can respectfully say, well, I don't see it that way, or I would do this
Sure.
differently. And what we have to do is get back in the practice of having
Totally.
those conversations.
Yeah, and I think the Washington Post poll found that 6 out of 10 Americans are supportive of DEI efforts, and some of that, I think, is driven by young people. And as a manager myself, the groups that I found most consistently offended by workplaces that were not diverse are actually white millennials. White millennials want to work in diverse settings in all the ways that you just itemized, and I think we forget about the alleged kind of mainstream group that might feel left behind, but also is demanding modernity through, could my workplace look like every other part of my life, right? Where I live, or, and that kind of demographic reality.
Yeah, so interesting. And we just have to keep having these conversations in an inclusive way, right? It starts with even just how we have them. So we've had a couple of great questions coming in while we've been talking, and I want to ask you one of them. Again, we'll try to get to as many as we can. This one says, I'm pleased to see people of color in the media. Some people, however, argue that the people of color in media far exceed their percentage in the population. What do you think of that?
So that's actually not true. So the American Society of News Editors has conducted studies of who's employed in newsrooms around the country, and people of color are woefully underrepresented, compared to their percentage of the U.S. population. The area that I think the person asking the question might be referring to is our newscasts, right? And who's on broadcast television. It's rare. I mean, it's still possible, but it's rare that you have, for example, two white men delivering the evening news in a local market. That's a very intentional decision that reflects gender. You mentioned gender as an important aspect of diversity. News stations being for the most part headquartered in cities. Cities tend to be more diverse. Many, of course, in the US are majority minority cities. And so you want the newscasters to reflect the population. There are some, I don't want to say stereotypes, but for example, Asian women delivering the evening news became much more mainstream and accepted, largely thanks to the efforts of pioneers like Connie Chung, right? And so you have these trailblazers that inspire generations, I mean, including myself, not that I'm delivering the evening news, but like you would see, and it's often said in DEI language, like, you can't be what you can't see. And
Mm,
so I think what you're also seeing with newscasters and really like the public facing aspects of broadcast media is that they inspire so many children to be like, actually, maybe I could do this. And I think that's a great thing. I have to say, from behind the scenes, we are still, it feels woefully underrepresented in my industry.
mm. Thank you for that. I have another great question that goes along with a question I was going to ask you too. So I'm going to combine them for the sake of time. My question was, I'm sure we have a lot of people right now who are watching that are part of DEI departments that have experienced cutbacks. And just wondering what your advice to them is. And hand in hand with that is a question that came in from the audience that says, how do you attempt to increase engagement in DEI surveys when staff is not being responsive or kind of
Yeah.
still in disbelief? And so hand in hand with advice to DEI departments that are getting cut back and then engaging staff.
Great question. I mean, I think one is to just remember the power we have, right? We have power as employers, we have power as managers, we have power when we contract with vendors, when we decide who to hire, although I would argue that many of our DEI efforts focused on who we were hiring versus all of the other power in an organization. So if your chief diversity officer used to be there and is now not, or it was a department and now it's under-resourced, or it's one person, it used to be four, you probably still have a procurement office. You probably are still doing business and looking for, a caterer for your next offsite or your meeting. You might still have a travel budget. You might still make decisions around, who's doing your recruitment or where you're advertising. I mean, so much of URL media is set up with this belief that, yes, you should support community media and ethnic media because you're supporting what we represent, but you're also supporting trusted messengers in communities in a time that so much of media is actually not trusted, right? So who can you still turn to? I think our dollars and where we're spending them matter more than ever from a DEI perspective. There's still a lot of work that we could do there. The other aspect I would say is exactly, Ashley, what you alluded to in terms of conversation, right? I think that there was maybe an assumption, or maybe kind of maybe took for granted that like the outcome of 2020 was going to be, companies like mine and the diversity office, or we're going to get to hire, we're going to, and I actually think conversing over how our workplaces can be more inclusive and not relying on resources. So is it a retention play with who you already have? Who can we amplify? Like, all of us have social media accounts, right? All of us have this power. And I think kind of absent in the rollbacks of DEI has been seizing the power that all of us still have to uplift one another.
Hmm.
On the surveys, this is a tough one because I think employee engagement right now, it's like The thing about DEI is a lot of stuff is brushed under like DEI when we're actually dealing with disaffected workplaces, very fragile economies, the displacement from AI and, you know, the elections and technological upheaval and economic upheaval, like those are very real factors, right? The cost of housing in cities, like that's something I deal with my own staff all the time. So I think we'll often kind of tuck some of these issues as like DEI issues. And it's like, look, if our generation of 20 somethings can't buy houses in the places that we are setting up our companies, what's the conversation we're having about that? So I think from a survey perspective, maybe asking about DEI is actually excluding what people care about because they might not see themselves reflected in your DEI survey. I guarantee them if you asked about, housing costs, inflation, which are all, of course, connected to how we make people feel like they belong in cities and workplaces in our society at large, like those are really key issues. So I would say language and our need to be more inclusive. The last thing I'll just say is like throwing in raffles and free gift cards for surveys always works.
Right? I mean, there's just the tried and true things that
Yeah,
work.
yeah,
Yes.
the freebie. Yeah, yeah.
I want to acknowledge that we have fantastic questions coming in, which obviously we're not going to get to. I'm going to ask you one more, just kind of in the order that they've been coming in, but I want our audience members to know that we're going to follow up again. All of these questions we don't get to today. Mitra and I, we're going to connect and we're going to write up some answers and send them out along with some links to this webinar and so on. So the last question I want to just in a minute or so, if you can answer it. Do you think should companies shift their focus to belonging rather than inclusion? And there's been a couple of questions along this theme about like calling it DEI and pushback to that. Or is that very obvious?
I mean, I don't think it's obvious. Like, I actually think if you shift to belonging, um, the onus of setting the conditions for people to belong becomes an imperative for your managers. Now, what happens as a result? We must give them the tools to have
Mhm.
hard conversations, to be resourced. What do we do? Hey, you are pretty good at your job. Congratulations, you're going to supervise 5 people now. And we don't often offer like the training. And again, this is like, Ashley, what you all do. How do you have difficult conversations, right? So much of the workplace is rooted in conflict, but we don't train people in how to handle that conflict. So I think belonging must be accompanied by giving people the tools to both belong, but also enable belonging, right? I think that's a really important role that your middle managers will play. I think there's also unstated, which I'm just going to say is like, where do white people fit into this? Right. So a
That
lot of,
actually was another
oh,
question
is
that
that a
came up, which
question?
we can
Okay. Yeah.
elaborate on more,
So
but
belonging
yeah.
sometimes is like code for we need to bring more people along, or like you're seeing that now with neurodiversity and to some extent gender inclusivity, like that's a way to include white Americans, but not say like we're going to include white people in this. And I think that's hard. It's hard for companies to legally, kind of call this out. Like I also think there's just hesitance to talk about this at work. So I just want to acknowledge that. But that being said, 100% this, these allies and this type of partnership must be a part of the solution, right? How do you take company? I'm going to use the company and the corporate example. Um, it's Silicon Valley knows this. Like it's really hard to undo the mission of a company. How you start might be how it ends. And so if diversity is kind of just like a afterthought or something, and it's not built into your mission, what we need to do is to take the mission of the company and figure out a way that this becomes a part of it. And to not have white leadership be a part of that solution and partnership, to me, that feels really short-sighted.
Amazing. I'm sure we all feel like this conversation could just continue and continue, and we want it to. I also want to kind of note that, we have resources for workplace leaders. And so I really encourage you, if you haven't already, this conversation, along with all of the other challenging ones that you are having to kind of figure out and navigate, we are constantly providing, whether it's weekly videos or toolkits or webinars like this, everything is posted on this QR code that you see. And so I just really encourage you, if you are looking for resources, especially relevant ones, I mean, literally every week, there's new stuff on there. Check this out, because that's how we NCRC are here supporting you through these conversations, including we just posted 10 tips for navigating the political divide, which I think all of us probably are thinking about in some way or another. So be sure to kind of look into that. Also just want to kind of mention a couple of other resources, including one that Mitra has shared with us. The first is that we are offering a certificate program for workplace leaders who are specifically looking for skill building and how to have these difficult conversations. And it might be about DEI initiatives, it might be about politics, it might be about different strategies that you're looking at. Please check out the certificate program. And then if you want to know more about URL Media and know more about some of the resources that Mitra has shared with us today, please check out their website where you can subscribe to their newsletter. You're also going to see in chat, we're going to post a few links that Mitra has shared with us that are also great resources for you. So keep those in mind. I want to remind everyone that we're going to follow up with a link. Like tomorrow, you'll get a link to this live recording, but then in maybe a week or two, we'll follow up with a more full-fledged kind of article with some of the wonderful questions that we did not get to today. Thank you so much to all of you for asking such thoughtful, great questions. We'll follow up and make sure that you continue to get these resources. With that, I just want to thank Mitra so much for having
Thank
such a
you.
fantastic conversation and joining us here today.
It's an honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your week.